good to see you all. Thanks for coming. This is all quite intimidating and fabulous. So as Sammy said, I'm Stephen Jones. I'm a lecturer. I work in a Department of Theology and Religion at the University of Birmingham, but I am by training a sociologist. So that, broadly speaking, means I sort of do surveys of what people believe, and I interview people. I've spoken to a few of you already today. And I'm just going to talk a bit about what the kind of work that I do, and what it suggests, the kind of projects I've been involved in, and then a bit about sort of, I guess, my general role in university. So if anyone has any questions about either research work or about universities and coming to university, then I'm more than happy to sort of talk about that. I'll just sort of take you through a bit about what I do. I've not sort of prepared too much. I do a lot of talking about my research, and like a lot of academics, I can happily talk for hours on end about it if I need to. But I thought I'd just try and give a sort of brief overview and a few little nuggets about the kinds of things that I'm interested in. And then we can sort of have hopefully a little bit of a back and forth as we go, and we can be on research questions or issues that are interesting, or just anything at all, really. So as I say, I'm a sociologist, and I'm a sociologist of religion, I guess is the best way of describing what I do. So I don't know if any of you study sociology at school level or anything like that, or have any idea what that involves really. But basically, it's a kind of academic discipline where I try to understand what people believe and why, and how societies kind of cohere and change and things like that. So I'm a bit unusual one. So as I mentioned, I'm here to sort of talk a bit about Islam and science, but the strange thing about being a sociologist is you don't get to have opinions yourself. You're more interested in what other people's opinions are. And what I'm really interested in is just getting to a point where, as a society, we can talk in a way that's much more accurate and much more open about the kinds of beliefs we hold, the kinds of societies we are. And especially around Muslim communities in the UK. So I've been studying Muslim communities in the UK for around, oh goodness, this is going to reveal my age a little bit, going on for 15 years. And sometimes in an organised capacity. There's an organisation called the Muslims in Britain Research Network. I used to lead that for around 3 years. I don't anymore. I passed over to some colleagues, and that's a small network of academics that study Muslim Britain and write about how Muslims in the UK, how the population has changed, how Muslim institutions are developing, like this one in fact, so how Islamic schools were set up and how they relate to universities and further education colleges and things like that. So that's part of what I'm interested in, just looking at how Muslim communities exist in the UK and how they interact with the wider world around them. That, on the other side to that, is I'm interested in questions about Islamophobia and anti-Muslim discrimination. I was the author of a report earlier this year which was about the levels and nature of Islamophobia in the UK. If you Google around an Islamophobia and put my name in, you might even see it was in the news in around January, because we ran a survey which tried to assess the way people think about Islam in the UK. And one of the things that we found that I thought was quite interesting, if somewhat depressing, because public perceptions of Islam in the UK are not particularly positive. I mean, it's a minority perspective having negative dispositions towards Muslims, but it's higher than it is towards many other groups. But what we found was that there's a large amount of confusion about what Muslims believe and how they think about the Quran and other forms of religious teaching. And the thing that interested me most is that we tend to assume that prejudice tends to be sort of something that's more concentrated amongst people who are from working class backgrounds. You see, I don't know if you follow the political news over the last few years, you see a lot of discussion of so-called red wall voters, because constituencies in the UK that went from Conservative to Labour to Conservative at the last election, because apparently Boris Johnson had appeal amongst the working classes. And that there are all kind of narratives about immigration and so on that come with that. But what we found in that survey, interestingly enough, was that the people who tended to make the biggest mistakes about Islam were actually the more educated people, the people from upper and middle class backgrounds, because as I argued in that, we tend to be sort of systematically miseducated about Islam in the UK through our media and through the different education systems we inhabit and so on and so on. So that's part of what I'm interested in, questions of Islamophobia, and how we have a more meaningful conversation about Islam in the UK and about religion in the UK more generally. And part of that is to do with how I think about Islam and science. So I'm interested not so much in, how do you reconcile science and religion? Is there a need to reconcile them? What kind of scriptural approaches and different ways of reading scripture and different other forms of religious text do you need to try and harmonize science and religion? That's the question for the folks at the back over there who teach you. I'm more interested in questions about how people kind of perceive religion and science. And it's an area where you get certain forms of prejudice emerging, and it's one of the things that we try and unpick in certain circumstances, and particularly around science educators and science communicators. So just to kind of give an illustration of this, I've been involved in a project that's about 7 years old now. It's called Science and Religion Exploring the Spectrum. And it's not just focused on Muslims' perceptions of science, it's focused on non-religious people and Christians as well. And we did surveys, so this is myself and I have a colleague, Professor Fern Elston-Baker at the University of Birmingham, who I've worked with for the last 7 years, and a couple of other colleagues as well. And ran surveys in various different countries, the United States and in Canada and the UK. We're going to be doing similar surveys in Germany and Spain, and we're hoping Sri Lanka as well, but because of the political situation in Sri Lanka, which you may or may not be aware of, that's proving harder than we anticipated. So what we tried to do is we asked people about what do you believe about different aspects of science, and so the one I'll focus on here is belief about evolution, and because there tend to be very strident claims about how religious people think about evolution in public media. And what we tended to find is that actual levels of people who are just outright not accepting evolution in this country is very low. It's something around 9%, and that's using a measure that tends to overstate the amount of evolution disbelief in the UK. And yet, when you ask people what we call in my little research unit second order questions, so it's not about what you believe, but what do you think other people believe? So we ask people firstly, do you have a problem with evolution? And the numbers are very low. Then we ask people, do you think religious people would struggle to accept evolution? And a majority of the people in this country say yes. So there's a huge disconnect between what people actually believe and what people think other people in society believe. There's a huge mismatch. And part of what we do is to try and correct that a little bit by just trying to sort of gather slightly better data and try and understand what it is about science and religion that kind of leads them to always being presented as being in conflict. I work with a bunch of historians because the research I do is not just sociological, it's something that brings together psychologists and historians and various other academic disciplines. And we try and look at the ways in which the kind of the historical narration of the relationship between science and religion causes these kinds of opinions to develop over time. For example, I mean, this is just an example from history. Here's a quick question to anyone who wants to have a guess. The word scientist, how old do you reckon that word is? Anyone said, throw a date at me. Do you think it's 100 years old, 1,000 years old? The English term, scientist. Right, have a go.
200 years.
200 years. That's not too far off. It was only coined in 1820. So yeah, actually almost exactly 200 years. So it's coined in 1820. It didn't really become popular as a term until 1870s-ish. So whilst we think of science, if you read a history of science, it will go back to, ancient Greece 3,000 years ago. The actual idea of a scientist is very, very recent. And part of the reason that professional category developed was because certain institutions were trying to break free of the Anglican Church at the time. So if you track back 200 years, the only universities really in 1820 are Oxford and Cambridge, and then some others in Scotland. And a bunch of professional, what would become known as scientists, were trying to win institutional autonomy. And as part of that, they sort of tried to develop the idea of being a scientist as an independent sphere of inquiry. So you can see from these kind of historical examples that the idea of a kind of conflict between science and religion emerged partly because of that history. So you have, I don't know if any of you are looking to attend university anytime soon, or have looked at different university options that you might be pursuing. but there's Oxford and Cambridge are obviously the two elite in the UK. They were set up by and very closely associated with the Anglican Church and have been for hundreds of years. University College London, one of the other older universities, nowhere near as old as the other two, that was very specifically set up as a kind of non-religious institution, in part because of arguments with the Anglican Church at the time. So it's partly because of that history we have this kind of historical conflict, and what it's led to is people assuming science and religion sort of stand in tension all the time and throughout history, when really it's just sort of product of our more recent past. So that's kind of the research I do. I don't want to talk for too long, and goodness knows I can. So that's a sort of overview of the kind of research I'm interested. I just wonder if anyone has any kind of questions about that work or other research I've done in Muslim communities or anything to do with university life generally. I'm all ears essentially. So does anyone have any kind of questions they want to throw out there, or even at the back if you have any queries? This is where lots of folks get very shy.
Did you just use a survey to see how much people would like? Did you just use surveys or questions?
Yeah, so we do a bunch of things. So I'm an unusual sociologist in that I do, so sociology, for those who don't know it too well, tends to come in two main branches. One is quantitative research, which is more numerical, and one is qualitative. So today, for me, this is me with my qualitative hat on, because I'm coming in and talking to you and sort of sitting in this classroom and so on. And I do both the quantitative side and the qualitative side. So with surveys, what we do is we design a survey and sort of usually contract it out to something like a company like YouGov or Ipsos Mori or Comres, who will then ask those questions to a whole bunch of people, normally about 1,000 to 2,000, and that gives you a sense. But the trouble with surveys is that people tend to treat them as very authoritative, when oftentimes they're much more inexact as a way of measuring public opinion. You can see that in the way they get our politics quite wrong sometimes. And the problem that we have with surveys in the field of the study of science and religion and different religious populations' beliefs about science is that most of them were developed in the United States, and they often ask questions about the Bible. You know, do you believe that the earth is 10,000 years old, for example, which is it comes from a very distinct reading of Genesis in the Bible. And then people will take that question and just ask a bunch of people in the United Kingdom about it, not really thinking about what kind of religious tradition they belong to, and the answers you get will be very misleading. So partly what we do is try and do better surveys, but also to try and build on that, we try and do interviews to kind of get a sense of how people think themselves. You get all kinds of interesting things asked when you do like interview work, because some people, you know, they're making up their opinions as they go. Sometimes they've thought about it in advance. Sometimes they have very daft opinions, and sometimes they're very sophisticated opinions. And I worked with a former colleague who did his PhD looking at Muslims' perceptions of science. So not necessarily people who are scientists or people who are religious leaders, but just everyday folk. And he would not often, but sometimes at least, be talking to people about evolution, and what they'd be talking to him would be the kind of the Genesis style account, the Christian account of evolution, because they'd not really studied much of their own tradition. So that kind of stuff is often missed when you do survey work. So it's not something I just rely on solely, I think.
Is the information based on primary research or secondary research?
Sorry, I can't quite.
Is the information based on primary research or secondary research?
Inevitably, it's a bit of both, I think. So and it depends a bit on what project I'm working on and writing on. What you try to do ideally as a sociologist, I think in any kind of sphere of science, really, social science or natural sciences, is you try and build up the best picture you can on what evidence is available. And necessarily you can't just use primary sources for that, because you can't just use your own research, because that's always just going to be one snapshot of one particular moment in time. So ideally what you try and do is synthesize a bunch of sources to try and get as broad a picture as you can. And sometimes that works. So if you go on Amazon, and I'm lumbered with a name that's very common in the UK, so it's hard to Google me, but I have a book out called Islam in the Liberal State, and what I tried to do in that was look at Islamic educational institutions, a bit like this place here, and sort of legal institutions, kind of that's like Sharia councils and lobbying and activist organisations. And I don't have enough time in the world to understand all those three things. So you have to sort of bring together a whole range of data and try and synthesise it, would be the jargon. Try and see, what does this map of the territory tell you? What can you infer from that kind of information? And so how do you sort of work through it and develop some kind of a conclusion? So it's not all just about primary research. At the same time though, part of the reason we do try and get funded to do our own interviews and surveys and so on is precisely because of what I was talking about a moment ago. You find that quite often people will bake in their own assumptions into their own research projects, and sometimes you actually have to go out and ask people things because there is a problem with the research data that you have at the moment. The classic of that is, and in fact this is research I've done myself, and I'm being sort of self-critical about it to some extent, but we developed a set of measures about how people really read their religious scripture. Are they, in the sociological jargon would be, are people scriptural literalists, that is, take everything in their religious scripture word for word as true, or are they more flexible in their interpretation, sort of reading things symbolically? Now, that kind of set of questions can work quite well if you're talking to just a Christian audience, or just a Christian sort of constituency of people who are polled. You say, do you think the Bible is true word for word, and do you think this, that, the other? If you ask that in a Muslim context, it makes no sense at all. It just doesn't work, because the Quran is a different book to the Bible and it's read different. So part of what we have to do is try and develop our own ways of doing research that avoid those kind of problems. And when you do research that's cross-cultural, those problems become bigger and bigger and bigger, because if you do, science and religion research in India is very, very different to how it is here, for example. So there's one at the back there.
So when you do speak about science and religion, are you speaking in terms of science in general, or particular science, so meaning health science or something to do with engineering, something like that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. We do sort of focus on very specific things at times, but then science in general too. The thing I find fascinating about this kind of research, we focused on evolution mostly as a sort of point of interest, and that's partly because it's been such a point of conflict, particularly in the United States, and that's been the case to the extent that it's kind of shaped the whole field of study in a way. And there have been vigorous debates in the United States, not just about evolution itself, but how best to understand the conflict in the United States around those things, and whether it's more to do with politics and identity than it is science as such. So that's part of the reason we focus on that. But we try and focus on other things too, because science is, for people, it's not just a kind of abstract thing. It's not just about where do people come from and how should we see the human species. It's something we engage with day to day. I mean, this is very obvious to us now, coming 2 years after being stuck at home because of COVID regulations, right? So it's about how we think about scientific authorities. But then the other thing that I quite like and I'm interested in is looking at science in a sort of general, as a concept, as an overarching thing, and looking at the way that people sort of invest themselves or see themselves as being part of science as well. Like, one of the interesting things with being a researcher is you say, I've done this for like 7 years now, and we've done this research in about 5-6 different countries with hundreds and hundreds of people, and I know lots of colleagues who do similar research. No one thinks they're against science. No one says, oh, I hate science, it's terrible, and I'm not science, I don't agree with it at all, because science has such cultural power in the UK and in other countries that it kind of stands in for truth. If you're not science, if you're not for science, then you're for being an idiot, basically, is that's how it's sort of seen. And so, but that doesn't mean there are no kind of conflicts over it or denial of it, or because people read it in very different ways. And so if I talk to sort of non-religious and humanist people, and they talk about science in a very different way to the way religious people might, and they sort of weave it into their identities, and that's something that I've tried to write about a bit as well. There's one over to the left there.
What made you know?
Oh, me? Yeah, that's a tough question. So I am from an Anglican background. I tend to describe myself as agnostic these days, but not in a kind of I tend to prefer not to say in a strange way because I always find that the tick box exercise is a bit constraining. So my parents are both Christian. They come from a tradition in Christianity, or my dad at least comes from a tradition called the Plymouth Brethren, which is a sort of radical Protestant side. In my wider family, we run the whole range from Anglo-Catholic through to quite radical Protestant. At the same time, I've been studying Islamic studies for so long, the way I think about religion is sort of partially inflected by the Islamic tradition as well. So I'm kind of mixture of the two, but ultimately kind of somewhere between all of them at once. So I'm sort of woolly agnostic as a result, I think. That's basically where I sit. Oh, agnostic. Oh yeah, that's so agnosticism is basically a term that we use today for don't really know, and in stronger versions don't really know and don't think you can find out. It actually comes from, there's an interesting history of the term, and weirdly enough, I work with a guy, Bernie Lightman, Professor Bernie Lightman, who's at the University of York in Toronto, not in the UK, who is the global expert in the history of agnosticism. It was coined by a guy called Thomas Huxley, who was one of Darwin's kind of main sort of advocates. He's sometimes referred to as Darwin's bulldog. And if you read like the British Humanist Association, he's often sort of styled as this sort of hardline atheist figure, but actually he was not. He didn't like theologians very much, but he also had a religious faith, and he described himself as agnostic because of that. Comes from the Greek term Gnosticism, which is like obscure knowledge it comes from, but that's where it comes from. So it's about 100-year-old, isn't it?
You mentioned you made a book on Amazon. How long did it take you to make that book in terms of taking research and drafts and writing out whatnot?
That book, years. I mean, literally 10 years that one took, which is not the normal thing. So the reason it took so long is because, so I did a PhD in the late 2000s, and it was on what I was interested in. I started writing about Islamophobia, basically, in a sociology department. I got a bit cross about a year into it because a lot of sociologists are not very good at doing religion. They sort of will write about religious communities and identities and racism and so on, but without really having much interest in what religion is and how religious knowledge works and how people sort of religiously identify and differences of opinion within religious communities. And so I got a bit frustrated with that and ended up doing a PhD about kind of internal differences within Muslim communities, mainly in the London area, sort of talking about questions about politics and engagement with politics. But then when I finished the PhD, I went off to work at the University of Bristol on a project that was about religion and politics, and it was like much better resourced than my PhD was. And so I started writing, and then I stopped writing, and eventually I kind of came to this view a few years down the line that you can see a consistent pattern in the way Islamic institutions in the UK are operating. There's often a narrative, and it's very common amongst our political leaders, that David Cameron especially was a real headbanger for this, that Islamic institutions in the UK are kind of set apart from wider society, that they don't really engage. They sort of, you're here learning about Islam and then you don't engage with the wider world kind of thing. And one of the things that I found, and this is like over these years of research, is that not just in Islamic educational settings, but you can see this across a range of different examples, that there are much more sophisticated forms of engagement with public infrastructure amongst the Muslim community in the UK, that where once Islamic institutions that would be quite conservative and isolated, they're now starting to find agreements with, or set up agreements with, universities and further education colleges in the UK, which just wouldn't have been possible 10 years ago. I'm working in a department which has an agreement with another Islamic seminary in Birmingham. There are agreements set up with universities in Middlesex and other Shia colleges in London and so on. And it seemed to me that again and again you would find examples of this, like in the sphere of politics, people would be working with different MPs and starting to develop relationships, even in Islamic law and Sharia councils in the UK, whilst they have their issues and there are clearly sort of tensions between Islamic legal practice and English law, there's a greater sort of synthesis between the two that's emerging. And so that sort of opinion formed over time, and then I was like, well, I may as well write a book about it, so I did. And the actual writing of the book took about 2 or 3 years. It's quite a hefty thing to do, that kind of a book. Some books are a lot quicker to write, but it's a lot of effort, and the trouble with academic life, it doesn't leave you as much time for writing and doing your research as you'd like. But yeah, so they're quite lengthy things. But I think there's something, in a weird way, the slowness of academia is a constant frustration to me and many other academics, but it has its benefits too. You can kind of step back and take a broader view of things than you can in the news media, where everything has to run very, very quickly.
What exactly is your definition of Islamophobia?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, that's one I could talk about for a clear hour if we had the time. So there's a bit of history to this, where in 1997 there's an organisation called the Runnymede Trust tried to publish the first definition of Islamophobia, and then more recently the same organisation, Runnymede, it's now just called Runnymede, and an all-party parliamentary group on British Muslims, which is like a network of cross-party MPs, published a report called Islamophobia Defined, which, so there are several definitions that are out there, and the older ones will tend to emphasise religion a bit more than the newer ones. The newer ones tend to define it as in terms of anti-Muslim racism. And so I started writing about this about a bit more than a year ago, and part of what I wanted to argue was that it's kind of both at the same time, and the two things have to be treated as overlapping but in some senses separate. So I do fully agree with the APPG definition that Islamophobia can be regarded as a form of racism. I think that's very easily arguable if you think seriously about it. It's not the same as skin colour, but racism never really has been about just skin colour. You know, if you look at anti-Irish racism and the extent of that in the early 20th century, there's a form of racism there which had all the hallmarks, even a kind of quasi-scientific vocabulary, but skin colour wasn't really at play. And in the Muslim case, you can see in the history of, say, Muslim Spain and the gradual reconquest of Spain, that was fundamental to the emergence of modern scientific racism. So the idea that Islamophobia can't be racism just strikes me as fundamentally wrong. At the same time, where I sort of get off that bus, as it were, is that you can find, and this was part of what I was doing with this survey, is that if you ask people questions about Islam as a tradition that are designed to test sort of people having prejudiced opinions, and then if you ask questions about things like, you know, the sort of Donald Trump type questions, do you want to ban migration to the UK from different ethnic groups or from Muslims? The people who answer that they do want to ban migration, there is a different set of people to the people who make bold claims about Islam as a tradition. And if those two things are both prejudice, but they're different groups of people being prejudiced in different ways, then I think it helps to separate the two out. And I think it helps as well to think of racism, on the one hand, as about discrimination and about prejudice and harassment and so on, but also it has to be on some level about the way we talk about religion in public life. So are we accurately representing different religious traditions? So am I taking up too much time here? I don't know.
Oh, no. So we have
Still.
come to the end of our time. You have a question? Is it going to be a long one to answer?
It might be short.
Okay, there we go.
I can
We'll
keep
take
it
this
short
as the
if we
last
need to.
one.
All right then.
What do you feel like is the largest driving factor for Islamophobia?
The largest driving factor, it's probably our media. I mean, the media in the UK is
Media, it
pretty
just
much.
news or like social media as well?
I think it's, I mean, social media plays a part. I think there's a tendency to demonise social media and present it as somehow responsible for all our ills. When I got into doing this work, it was immediately after 2001. Twitter didn't exist, Facebook didn't exist, but the stuff that the tabloid press was getting away with printing was, to my mind, completely scandalous, completely false, and it became so normalised, especially in the period after the London bombings in 2005. You had like wild conspiracies about sort of demographic colonisation and so on. And I think that the problem we have in our media in the UK especially, it's not exclusive to the UK, in France and the US have problems with Islamophobia that are as bad, if not potentially worse than here. But we have very bad regulation. There's very little recourse for someone who is libelled. You know, David Cameron libelled a guy as a terrorist, and he did so in Parliament, and there's no legal recourse for that person because, you know, parliamentary privilege and so on. And there are good reasons for that in some ways, but there's very little awareness that media has even a responsibility to sort of try and represent people in a way that's even faintly accurate. And I think that's the main thing, that if I could try and effect social change in one area, that would probably be it.
Okay, thank you so
All
much. Can we have a round of mashallah? Yeah, we really wanted more time, but they've got to be out by.
That's
1:30.
absolutely fine, don't
Can
worry
we
at
just
all.
have the girls' class? So this class is called Zainab Evelyn Cobble.
Mm-hmm.
This class is called Abdullah William Quilliam.
Oh, right, all after historical figures,
Yes.
I was saying. Yeah.
Boys, you can avoid. If you come from the front, just avoid the using the camera back.
Yeah, that's it.
There we go. Is that okay? Thank you so much.
No
for
problem.
coming here and doing this. And they were really engaged as well. They really.
Well, it's good to do, isn't it? I mean, I like talking to other videos, talking to other
Yeah.
just talking amongst your own little unit, aren't you?
Yeah. Yeah.
We are servants. Are we able to get